Coming up, we recap a dramatic start to the 2022 NFL season. This is Locked On Game to Game NFL.
Every game, every team, every angle. Locked On Game to Game, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Game to Game NFL. I'm Kainani Stevens. Thank you for making Locked On your first listen every single weekday. We are ready to recap a very eventful week one of the NFL season from the people that know these teams the best, our Locked On NFL hosts. The New Orleans Saints stormed back in the fourth quarter against the Atlanta Falcons to start 1-0 on their season. Locked On Saints goes over the game winner to start their year, while Locked On Falcons recovers after watching a double-digit lead disappear in the fourth quarter.
The Atlanta Falcons opened the 2022 season by blowing a 16-point lead to the New Orleans Saints. I'm Ross Jackson, host of the Locked On Saints podcast. The New Orleans Saints escape right here in Mercedes-Benz Stadium with what feels like a win for the ages, even though it's just the first week of the NFL season. But if this New Orleans Saints team proved anything today, it's that the brand of football that head coach Dennis Allen said that they wanted to establish from earlier on way early in the offseason even, about being a team that is tough, that is resilient, and that is competitive, that the New Orleans Saints did exactly that and proved exactly that today with their 1-point win here in Atlanta. Jameis Winston nearly perfect in the fourth quarter. Michael Thomas saying that the New Orleans Saints wide receiver core has so much more left to prove because they didn't get started really until the second half. This was a team that struggled early on, particularly in the trenches on the offensive and defensive line, but still pull away with a resilient and resounding win here in the ATL. For more on this win and your New Orleans Saints, make sure you're following along on the Locked On Saints podcast, free and available on all platforms, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
It was another embarrassing collapse for the Falcons, blowing a 16-point lead to their hated rival, the New Orleans Saints, in week one. I'm Aaron Freeman, the host of the Locked On Falcons podcast. So the more things change, the more they stay the same. And if you thought the Marcus Mariota era of Falcons football would be drastically different from the Matt Ryan era of Falcons football, you would have been right. Have you watched the first three quarters of this Falcons Saints week one matchup? Mariota and the Falcons had a dominant day on the ground thanks to a career rushing day from running back Cordero Patterson, who had 120 of the team's total 201 rushing yards. That pushed the Falcons forward to a very strong start in the first three quarters, going up 26-10 at the beginning of the fourth quarter. But the Falcons then did the thing that they're most infamous for doing, and they blew a lead thanks to some conservative defense and allowing the Saints to score 17 unanswered points on their final three possessions to lose the game 27-26. There was a late game heroic attempt on a 63-yard field goal from Younghoe Koo in the closing seconds, but that was blocked. And the Falcon 2022 season starts with another disappointing loss. You think at this point in time we'd be used to it with the Falcons, but you can never quite get used to disappointment. For more coverage of this loss, follow Locked On Falcons wherever you get your podcasts, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Carson Wentz's first start for the Commanders is a win, and that's in big part to his own performance for the team. He filled up the stat sheet, and Locked On Commanders tells you how he and the Washington defense were able to put away Jacksonville.
Quite a roller coaster experience for the Washington Commanders as they get their first week of the season, 28-22, over the Jacksonville Jaguars. Captain Commander Carson Wentz taking command in the first half, coming out cold in the second half, but finding enough juice in the end of the second half to pull out the narrow victory. The defense also clamping down when they needed to most. Derek Ford stepping in for injured star Cam Curl, coming with a game-sealing interception. Chris Russell and I are going to talk about all of that and more on the next episode of Locked On Commanders podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
The New York Giants went into halftime down 13 on the road and still no points on the season against the Tennessee Titans, but the New York team stormed back and with a chance to tie, instead they decided to go for the win. Locked On Giants tells you how it all played out.
The New York Giants overcame a 13-0 halftime deficit to deliver a stunning defeat of the Tennessee Titans, 21-20. Hi, everybody. I'm Patricia Traina, host of the Locked On Giants podcast. And for the first 30 minutes of their week 1 game against the Titans, the New York Giants pretty much picked up where they left off last year when they went 4-13. And in fact, the Giants actually looked like they were still in preseason mode. But in the second half, the Giants got hot, outscoring the Titans 21-7, beginning with a 4-yard touchdown run by Saquon Barkley, a 65-yard touchdown pass by receiver Sterling Shepard, and a 1-yard touchdown catch by fullback Chris Myrick. It was Barkley, though, recording his first 100-yard rushing game since December 2019, who carried his team. The fifth-year pro finished with 164 rushing yards on 18 carries, his third highest career total rushing yards. Tucked in there was a big 68-yard run that set up the Giants' first touchdown of the game. And let's talk about quarterback Daniel Jones. Jones completed 17 of 21 passes for 188 yards and 2 touchdowns, his first multi-touchdown game since November 28, 2021, in a 20-17 loss to the Kansas City Chiefs. Jones now has 12 games in which he's thrown for 2 or more touchdowns, with hopefully more still to come. Defensively, the Giants held star running back Derrick Henry of the Titans to just 82 yards on the ground on 21 carries, a 3.9 yards per carry average. And while the Titans did get themselves into position to win the game with time expiring in regulation, the Giants got a big break when kicker Randy Bullock's 47-yard game-winning attempt sailed wide left, preserving the Giants' 1-point margin of victory. Now, the New York Giants, 1-0 for the first time in week 1 since 2016, return home for the next 2 weeks, the first game of which will be against the Carolina Panthers, who are coming off a 26-24 loss to the Cleveland Browns. For all things New York Giants, be sure to keep it here on the Locked On Giants podcast.
Coming up, we'll have more from a thrilling week 1 in the NFL. This is Locked On Game to Game NFL. This edition of Locked On Game to Coming up, we'll have more from a thrilling week 1 in the NFL. This is Locked On Game to Game NFL. This edition of Locked On Game to Game is brought to you by BetOnline, the #1 spot for all of your online sports gambling needs. Football is back, the pros and college. So if you want to get in on the action, just head over to betonline.net. BetOnline, it's where the game starts. On Sunday, Minnesota allowed just 7 points in a home opening win, and Locked On Vikings is all smiles after the victory.
That was fun. What's up, everybody? Locked On Vikings podcast. Luke Braun here. Vikings win 23-7, a dominant victory in US Bank Stadium over the fearsome Green Bay Packers. Feels like they have now stated their case and stepped onto the grand stage to fight for this division in 2022. An almost perfect debut for Kevin O'Connell, about as close to perfect as you can get, with Justin Jefferson getting 184 yards on the day, Kirk Cousins approaching 300 on the day, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions for him. Absolutely fantastic stuff on both sides of the ball as well. A huge day for Zadarius Smith, huge day for Harrison Smith. The defensive scheme seemed to really have the Packers stuck in a rut in some of their most conservative concepts, and I don't think that they had another club in their bag that they could go to punish it. Maybe all that bluster about secrecy in the offseason paid off with this 23-7 win. The game was never close, and it was Vikings fans. It kind of feels close sometimes, but it never was close in actuality. The Vikings just closed it out and held Aaron Rodgers under 10 points. Beat him up, got a whole bunch of hits on him, and now they have to take their tail between their legs and go try to win week 2 while the Vikings have a chance to go off to a 2-0 start next time. For more insight on all of this, you can find the Locked On Minnesota postcast on the Locked On Minnesota Sports YouTube page, and you can find the Locked On Vikings podcast every Monday through Friday, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
The Arizona Cardinals offense didn't get going until late, and that'll just about always be too late to catch up when you do that against Kansas City. Locked On Cardinals goes over what went wrong on Sunday.
The 2022 NFL season couldn't have started any worse for the Arizona Cardinals, as Patrick Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs punished them at home 44-21, where the Cardinals didn't show any sort of urgency. They really didn't seem like they wanted to be playing football. It starts from the top with Cliff Kingsbury. The defense didn't show up at all, couldn't stop Patrick Mahomes a lick. The Kansas City Chiefs had 8 third down snaps, and they had 33 total first downs, meaning the Kansas City Chiefs offense paved the way for an absolute blowout today at State Farm Stadium. The redeeming qualities for the Arizona Cardinals: Kyler Murray hooked up with Hollywood Brown for a touchdown in somewhat of garbage time. If this is what we're going to see from the Arizona Cardinals moving forward, it's going to be a very uncomfortable season. Let's hopefully chalk this up to it being week 1, none of the starters really playing in the preseason, and pivoting to a better game as the Cardinals travel to Vegas to play the Raiders in week 2.
That's all for today on Locked On Game to Game NFL. Thank you for making Locked On your first listen every single weekday. Make sure you go and check out your team's Locked On podcast and subscribe to Locked On NFL on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Kainani Stevens, and this has been Locked On Game to Game.